thank you all the attendees and all the panelists that are gathered here today. We're very excited to have our second day of the Roundtable workshop. And without further ado, I would like to start with the first round of our event with Chloe Haddon, Natalia Menendez, and Jesus Salgado. Chloe, you have the word.
Thank you. Can you all hear me okay?
Perfectly.
Perfect. Thank you, Leslie, and thank you to Beck and Natalia and the whole group for the opportunity to present today. I'm Chloe Hayden. I'm a student, PhD student, of course, from the University of Hertfordshire in the UK, and my background is in law and legal study. I'm currently in my third year of my PhD, which is researching the ethical regulation of AI. And today my presentation aims to criticize the risk-based approach taken by the EU in the draft AI Act and highlight the benefits of a more focused human rights approach to regulating AI technology. So the AI Act, which was introduced in April of this year, has added to the numerous proposals and ethical guidelines towards regulating AI and represents part of the EU's attempt to transform their digital economy and regulatory supremacy. Although at first glance the AI Act seems quite promising, further exploration reflects numerous loopholes and a lack of proper care towards protecting fundamental rights. The AI Act uses a risk-based approach as its foundation, which, as you can see by the little pyramid on the screen at the top, there's unacceptable risk systems, which go down to the bottom to low and minimal risk systems. Unacceptable risk systems such as social scoring systems and those capable of distorting human behavior are banned outright due to the clear infringement towards fundamental rights. Although arguably this category is very necessary, it's already been criticized due to the lack of clarity relating to the expansion of the scope in the future. Real-time use of biometric systems such as facial recognitions for the purposes of law enforcement are also included in this list, but subject to some exceptions, which include the imminent threat to life and the detection of criminal offenders. Again, these exceptions have already caused worry due to the risk of widespread misuse and have been referred to as flawed by the European Data Protection Board and Supervisor. High-risk systems, which are the central focus of the regulation, are grouped into systems used as safety components and those designated by the Commission as high risk. These systems are allowed on the market subject to compliance with mandatory requirements and ex-ante conformity assessments. This category again has also raised concerns due to the likelihood of systems originally not being classified as high risk ex ante and turning out to have a detrimental impact on individuals and their rights, and therefore not being subject to the same safeguards. Minimal risk systems such as chatbots are subject to some transparency obligations, whereas low risk systems are in essence left unregulated. Leaving low-risk systems unregulated opens the door to the risk of wrongful classification, which will leave systems with little to no safeguards when sometimes they may need some. Emotion recognition systems are also listed under this category of minimal risk, and this arguably directly conflicts with the GDPR, which would consider these systems as high risk due to the processing of biometric data and special category data under Article 9. So this already reflects some inconsistencies with the current regulation by the EU, and this conflicts with the AI Act's aim to harmonise the European regulatory landscape and offer better protection to the public and fundamental rights. Criticism to the intention behind risk-based approaches have been highlighted by a number of authorities and bodies, including the Article 29 Working Party, who during the GDPR process make it very clear that a risk-based approach should not be chosen as an alternative to a fundamental rights-based approach. The fundamental rights approach is precautionary and ensures all systems are subject to a foundation of rules and safeguards to promote and encourage ethical AI, regardless of the risk that they pose. The benefits of this approach would allow regular assessments to assess systems based on the context that they're used in, and this would reduce the risk of systems falling through the cracks and not being subject to sufficient safeguards. The burden of proof should also be placed on developers and deployers of systems to release them of strict safeguards when necessary, rather than the other way around as it is currently. A human rights approach would also hold redress mechanisms at its core, which is essential for citizens and society as a whole to uphold fundamental right protections. And these are the main arguments as to why I think a human rights approach would be much better than a risk-based approach for EU regulation of AI. Thank you all for listening. I appreciate your feedback, comments, and questions, and I look forward to hearing the following presentations. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Chloe, so much for your presentation. We'll continue with Natalia.
Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So my name is Natalia. I'm a PhD researcher currently in the States at the European University Institute. My PhD focuses on the legal implications of the use of facial recognition technologies, especially when employed by law enforcement. So a state of facial recognition technology involves artificial intelligence, more specifically machine learning, and even more specifically deep learning, computer vision techniques applied to the face. It can perform 3 functions divided into 2 groups. The first one comprehends identification and verification, the ones I will deal with in this presentation. The second comprehends what has been called face analysis. We can appreciate a dichotomy between the technology and its use. For instance, facial recognition technology to find missing people, when it underperforms with a group of people, for example, Black persons, entails a harm for them. This is a problem within the design of the technology. However, we can find a perfectly performing technology that is used to oppress a minority of people, as it's the case with the Uyghur minority in China. In such case, the better performance, the big. In both the legal and ethical domains, there is a problem when the use of a technology that works perfectly entails conundrums. And that's why we need red lines. In those cases, via regulation, we restrict the use of certain technologies, products, such as weapons or barbed wires, who were prohibited in certain contexts out of human rights reasons. Conversely, we can allow a technology, but impose a specific design to prevent the unethical use of this technology. For instance, in counterfeiting. I don't know if you are aware of this, but it is not possible due to this EU Iron constellation to, for example, make copies or scan banks because watermark appears. And this is precisely something that has been embedded in the hardware of the printers or scanners or photocopy machines. So an ethical design of facial recognition technology prevents its unethical use, for instance, by codifying use limitations in the software or hardware design, such as in the example of the EU constellation. And in the facial recognition technology case, could be that when this technology detects a person belonging to the Uyghur minority, maybe could not identify them or could send a false match or a false result. On the other hand, imposing phenotypically diverse benchmarks on facial recognition technology would work also as clinical trials for medication. So when clinical trials for drug testings are entailed, they impose a certain threshold of performance, of accuracy. In the same way with a phenotypically diverse datasets for facial recognition technology, we can obtain a more ethical technology. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia, for your presentation. And now we will continue with Jesus.
You're still muted.
Sorry. So I will display my details at the end of the presentation. My name is Jesus Salgado, currently Professor of Business Administration and Entrepreneurship at the Polytechnic University in Madrid, and also an entrepreneur myself in the technology space. So what I would like to share is the approach and scope of a very, very early stage research. Has not even begun, so has not even started. Research about venture investment ecosystem and AI, and specifically if and how ethical considerations are included in this important economic activity, investor activity in technology startups that are AI based, because technology, at least from the investor point of view, is not neutral. You know, technology and products depend on investments, and these investments are justified to a great extent by the potential social and, above all, economic benefits that these developments could bring with it. So when you invest in technological development, you select the problems you want to solve over others that are that you consider secondary, no? And this is a very value-loaded decision. So my interest is to analyze the investment cycle and what role, if any, do ethical considerations play in the investment process. What are the reasons or motivations of the investments to of the investors to include these ethical criteria? Right? I know what you are thinking. I am going to get zero interest at best and whitewashing declarations at worst. Well, I wouldn't be so fast. Well, first, because we are researchers and we should not forecast the outcome of our own work. But secondly, there is already a very vibrant community of investors whose practice includes ESG criteria and environmental, social, and governance criteria, which was almost not known 10 years ago. So ethics is somewhat embedded in this type of criteria. Another reason why I think the outcome could be positive is whitewashing is actually not totally a bad outcome, because at the end of the day, you cannot cheat investors, customers, and employees forever, no? And last but not least, this research will be sponsored by an investor. So at least one investor is effectively interested in knowing if and why and how ethics is somewhat related to investment. In particular, what I would like to find out are all relevant aspects like first, level of awareness with investor community. To what extent investors in artificial intelligence startups are aware of ethically related risks to be avoided or opportunities for human rights to be promoted. No? Also, what type of ethical dimensions or issues in the negative and positive sides are considered or could be considered. No? Privacy is one, but there are others: fairness, transparency, autonomy, dignity, and many others that come to mind. No? So what another issue is to what extent these investors consider ethics to be in or out of scope in their analysis. To what extent they feel that ethics might be a limitation or a burden to be traded off against the return on investment. Can too much ethical concerns put at risk investment return, or maybe on the contrary, too few ethical concerns can also increase risk of an investment?
Jesus, sorry to interrupt you. You have 1 minute left. Sorry.
Right. So is ethics a differentiator in the industry, like maybe ESG, or I know this is really not ethics, but marketing, but might be well played for against, and many other potential issues, no, or questions, research questions. No, are there a difference between different types of investors, pure venture capital, corporate, public administration, etc. So, as I'm very early stage on the research, I'm eager for ideas, bibliography, suggestions, and also encouragement. I will put my contact details here in the screen, and also in the chat, so you can contact me if you have any suggestion or ideas or interest in the research. Thank you all, and thank you the organizers. This is really a great opportunity.
Thank you so much, Jesus, for your presentation. And now we will give space for questions from the audience. So I already have a first question for Chloe. Let me know what is the role, status, position of human values in human rights approach that you are working on? How do you engage them in the regulation?
Hi, Mustafa. Thank you for the question. So the human rights-based approach that I'm looking at sort of recommending or implementing in my research, instead of looking at sort of systems on a risk level of how much risk they're going to cause in terms of safety and danger, is just to look at the impact they have on fundamental rights. So I'm really holding fundamental rights at the sort of core of the regulation and building up from there. For example, as a starting point, I would have all AI systems subject to very, very strict assessment procedures, very strict safeguards. And then it's the burden of proof is down on the developers, the deployers of those systems, to prove that their systems are not that impactful to human and fundamental rights, and therefore then release them of those strict safeguards. So sort of working the opposite way from the risk-based approach, to pile on heavy with the safeguards and then remove them once it can be proven that the systems can sort of circumvent the risk of infringing human rights.
Okay, thank you, Chloe. I would have a question for Natalia. So in general, facial recognition, it's a very contested application of AI. Do you think that it can be a slippery slope in all cases? Or do you think there is like actual ethical ethical permissibility for applying AI to facial recognition?
Well, that's precisely the aim of my PhD, because I use the principle of proportionality, which is a legal instrument to balance when there are conflicts of different rights, for example, between freedom of expression and privacy, or the right to dignity. So basically my PhD is about which proportionality characteristics could entail a use of facial recognition that we can consider acceptable. So if there is a threshold when the problems of facial recognition, for example, the algorithmic bias that we are all very aware of, if there is a threshold when these problems are overcome by the competitive advantage that could entail, for example, helping to arrest suspects or identify missing people or things like that. And though this is the work that I will do in my PhD, so I will answer you better at the end of it. But I'm looking for.
Okay. And I have another question for Chloe. do you think there can be a common ground between a risk approach and a rights-based approach, or do you think they're completely exclusive?
I definitely think there is an overlap. I think the AI Act has sort of been advertised as following the GDPR approach, which is sort of half risk-based and half rights-based. Obviously, the GDPR has data subjects' rights at its foundation. And I think the AI Act should copy the GDPR in that way. It should have rights to AI users or AI data subjects or whatever you want to call them. And the foundation be sort of scoped around this rather than just essentially on the risk of the systems. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And Natalia?
I have one question for Chloe, if I may.
So first, Natalia that had their hand raised, and then Jesus.
Yes, it's a question/comment for Jesus. I don't know if you are focusing on private investors or public investors, because one thing that really struck me from the AI proposal from the European Commission is that although there are some red lines drawn by this proposal, for example, of facial recognition by law enforcement in public places, or certain things regarding border control and border management. At the same time, there are many European funded projects, such as by this Horizon 2020 and this kind of programs that precisely deal with these technologies, with the use of facial recognition in border management context, or the deployment of emotion recognition systems, for example, for groups. I'm aware of those kind of projects. So I sense a kind of contradiction between the text of the regulation and the, let's say, the financing decisions of the European government. So I wanted to know your opinion, and if in some case this is interesting for your research.
Yes, in fact, I'm interested in both. Well, in the main three types of investors. No, private investors might be pure venture capital. They might be corporations that are scouting for startups that might help them in their own business, and also public investment. And of course, what I could see is that public investment has to be more, if you want, more fine. In detecting ethical elements, because it's public funding that is developing mostly research. So this is developing technology, while as venture capitalists are mostly investing in products. So I would see that public investment needs to be a lot more scrupulous in this kind of, and I think that in Horizon Europe, for instance, it has defined ethics by design methodology and framework for the projects, at least those that are working with AI. And my very short, Leslie, sorry. My question to Chloe is, do you think that during the process in the parliament, there is a chance to actually change approach for the regulation? Thank you. Sorry for the noise.
Thank you, Jesus. Yeah, I definitely think there's, of course, time to make amendments and sort of sort out the proposal. Obviously, this was just sort of the first big official draft proposal. So I think it'll be a number of years, maybe even sort of going into a decade before it actually becomes law. So I think, yeah, there's plenty of time to sort of fix the inaccuracies or the loopholes and things like that.
Okay, thank you so much for the presentations to Chloe, to Natalia, and to Jesus. And now we would start with our second round. with Sylvie Saget, Trisha Griffin, and Karina Hertzbeck. And now we will continue with Trisha.
Okay, give me 1 second here. Okay, hello, and thank you. My name is Trisha Griffin, and I'm an early stage PhD researcher in the Faculty of Science and Engineering at Maastricht University in the Netherlands. My research involves two interrelated questions about artificial intelligence and machine learning developers as distinct ethical agents. So most of the conversation to date around ethical AI has focused on the ethics of the algorithms, the ethics of data sets, or the ethics of the companies deploying the AI. But discussions about the moral responsibilities of developers themselves have tended to stall because the work that they do can be so fragmented. A developer's distance from the end of the project and the fact that so many people may be contributing to the code has created the conditions for what's called diffused responsibility. And this is typically where the conversation stops. I'm unsatisfied with the status of the discussion around developer ethics. As an ethicist, I'm interested in how people work together to make ethical choices. And it's too diffuse or it's too difficult is not a good enough reason in my mind to stop talking about what we owe to each other. So I'm first asking a descriptive ethics questions, which is just, is there an internal morality specific to the developer as a profession? And I'll get to what I mean by that in a moment. Or are they technicians who simply adopt the morality of the industry in which they work? So for example, a machine learning developer, we're working in healthcare, she would write code and handle data according to medical ethics rules. And one working for a police department would adopt the ethics of criminal justice. The second is a more normative question, obviously, is whether or not there should be stronger professional responsibilities designated to these developers. So what do I mean by profession and technician? In my current model, in order to be considered a professional, you must meet 4 criteria. First, you must have specialized knowledge that comes through some kind of advanced degree or certification. Second, a community of practitioners who decide within their own cohort what constitutes a member of the community. So this might be a licensing organization, for example. And third, and this is an important one, is that you must profess. So in the Latin, the word for professional comes from the Latin professio, or a public avowal. So you make some kind of vow to always use your specialized knowledge for a primary goal or a good end. So we often think about medicine in this case. The fourth is the status of profession is granted to you by the public, including some special privileges and normative protections. And it's important to keep clear here that these protections are not always legal in nature. So a journalist, for example, might go to jail for protecting her sources, but it's unlikely that she will lose her job or her credibility or lose reputation as a journalist. And that's something that society does for that particular person in that profession because of that profession. A technician may have one or more of these, meet one or more of these, but they don't typically need all of them. There are 3 phases for my research listed here. I am in the early stages, so I'm still in what I'm calling the normative archaeology phase. So I'm researching the current state of this developer community and the ethics of what they consider to be a profession. I'm doing this via literature review and confidential interviews. I'm interested in interviewing developers to understand how they view themselves collectively. The second phase will be investigating how public dialogue can affect what it means to be a professional in this space. And I'll be using some analogous practices like medicine and anthropology, maybe even environmentalism to some extent, where robust dialogue with the public has impacted the rules of professional ethics. And third, I'm looking for case study, where the previous 2 phases can come together in a practical ethics project. How you can help. If you are an AI or ML developer, I would really like to interview. This would be anonymous and confidential, of course. If you work in a field where public dialogue and AI are very closely intertwined, I'd like to consider talking to you about the case study. And for everybody on here who's an AI ethicist, if any of this is intriguing to you, I'm happy to talk about any collaborations. And that's my presentation. Thank you kindly for listening, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A.
Trisha, thank you so much for your presentation. And now we'll continue with Corinna.
Sorry, it took me a second to unmute myself, but here we go. Hey everyone, thank you for coming. My name is Corinna. I'm a second-year PhD student in computer science at the University of Zurich and the Zurich University of Applied Sciences, and my work focuses on group fairness metrics and their use in practice. So just to get us started, I wanted to briefly talk about
I think Corinna, its connections, it's maybe a bit unstable, so let's wait maybe a moment to see if she comes back. Corinna, are you still there? Okay, so while Corinna comes back, maybe if anyone has a question that they would like to ask any of the other two panelists, this is a good moment to do it. Myself, I would like to ask a short, oh, okay. Yes, so Mostafa has a question for Trisha. So he asks, do you consider the society in the public dialogue phase as a socio-technical system in which different agents play their own roles? If not, what is your consideration?
That's a good question. I don't know that I've come to a satisfactory answer to that one just yet. But because I think that there are, again, there's a lot of people who are participating in these things. It's not just the developer who's writing a specific piece of code, but there's, you know, your manager who has certain obligations, the marketing team who might be selling it is something different from the way that you've conceived it. And so, but I do, the analogous practice for me that keeps coming back, and I come from a bioethics background, so the analogous practice for me really is medicine, where in the kind of early halcyon days of medicine, doctors just kind of experimented on whoever they wanted. There was one doctor who was just pulling homeless men off the streets and doing prostate surgery on them. And there was no consequences at all to that. And there would have been other people in that group of people, right, to identify who they are, do the surgery, and so that there is definitely a kind of diffusion of who could be considered responsible actors that I'm definitely looking into, but I don't want to get ahead of myself here. And so it is something I'm thinking about very closely. Yeah, thank you, Mustafa.
Thank you for the question, Mustafa, from the answer, Trisha. I think Corinna, it's back. I think she.
Yes, I'm back. So sorry about this. I lost my internet connection.
No worries. I think you can present from there now.
Okay, great. I can't turn my video on right now, but maybe we'll just leave it at that. That's fine. Yeah, I don't know what you guys heard, so I'll just start over. My name is Corinna. I'm a second-year PhD student in computer science at the University of Zurich and the Zurich University of Applied Sciences, and my work focuses on group fairness metrics and their usage in practice. So to get us started, I wanted to briefly talk about the role of group fairness metrics or fairness metrics in general in AI ethics, because a lot of the literature in algorithm fairness focuses on fairness metrics, but it's, I think, important to acknowledge that they're just one piece of the puzzle. So when we look at the ethics of a data science project, we can look at the problem formulation, the data collection, the technical properties of the model, the usage of that model, and a lot of other things. And the evaluation of fairness metrics is just one aspect of that, but many others also contribute to what we call fairness or ethics. And with that in mind, we can dive into fairness metrics, which are typically categorized into 3 broad groups. So one of them is group fairness. And for group fairness, we try to compare different sociodemographic groups, for example, groups defined by gender or race, and try to see if they're similar enough in some sort of metric. So for example, we could look at false positive rates and compare them across groups. For individual fairness, we demand that similar individuals are being treated similarly or receive similar outcomes. And for causal definitions of fairness, we define a causal graph, which then allows us to ask what-if questions, such as if I was born as a man instead of as a woman, would I be treated the same by this model? And so for individual fairness, we have to define what similarity means before we can measure anything. And for causal definitions of fairness, we need a causal graph. And so both of these groups require a deep understanding of the problem context of the domain before we can start measuring anything. For group fairness, this doesn't seem to be the case. It's basically immediately possible to measure group fairness metrics, because to measure false positive rates, we just needed a definition of groups, and then we can, and the model outputs, and then we can easily measure fairness rates across groups. So they're super easy to implement, and it seems like they would be very easy to use in practice because of this, and we can just lean back and move on to more difficult problems. But of course, this is not the case. There are a bunch of really difficult questions that we have to ask, and this is mainly because we know mathematically it's impossible to fulfill all of these group fairness metrics at the same time. And so we have to make a choice between them. And that, of course, brings up the question of how do we even make that choice? How do we know when to opt for one fairness metric over another? The other question, would be if these fairness metrics are maybe partially compatible. So maybe if we can fulfill 2 of them at the same time to some extent, even if we can't fulfill them fully. The next question would be, how do these metrics interact with accuracy or the decision maker's utility? How can we balance these different optimization goals? And then there's the question of the limitations of these fairness metrics and when they are insufficient to use and what their role is. And so group fairness metrics still require a deep understanding of the problem domain, just as is the case with individual fairness and causal definitions of fairness, and a lot of questions surrounding the use of group fairness metrics are still unanswered. So what now? The goal of my work is to enable stakeholders to have meaningful discussions about group fairness metrics and to build less discriminatory machine learning models this way. And I just briefly wanted to highlight some of the work I've done in this area so far. So 2 of my papers have focused on the choice problem, so on the question of how do we choose between different fairness metrics, and we've mainly focused on statistical parity, also known as independence, for this question. And then in another paper, we've looked at how we can gradually fulfill multiple fairness metrics at once. And in future work, I hope to expand on this choice question and on balancing, on the question of how to balance different optimization goals and the limitations of these fairness metrics. If you're interested in any of these questions, please feel free to reach out to me. And if you're interested in the project that I work on, you can find more information about that on fairai.ch. And with that, I think I'm out of time. Thank you so much for still making time for me after this internet connection incident.
Thank you for the presentation, Karina, and no worries. We all know that in this Zoom environment, so many things can happen, and you know, it's up to us to just be a little flexible. So I want to thank the panelists of this group, Sylvie, Karina, and Trisha. And this is now again time for questions from the audience, questions from the panelists, if anyone wants to remark or anything. I can start. I would like to ask a question to Karina. So you speak about fairness metrics, and then that sometimes you need to make a choice which one actually works or like it's more suitable. So in your opinion, what do you think about companies or stakeholders, as you put it, that incur in ethics washing? So deciding on their own which metrics suit them better for, let's say, purely capitalistic purposes, which is something that we have been seeing a lot in the last few years.
Yeah, exactly. I think there's a big risk for companies to just do some superficial evaluation of their models to see if they comply with some metric, but ignoring the bigger questions of ethics. Like the problem formulation could be super off, the way they use the model could be very problematic, but they just put a sticker on their model that says, this is bias-free, we've tested this, and here's a paper that outlines it, and this is super problematic. And I think we need to make sure that this doesn't happen. And for this, I think it's important to do more research on, well, basically what the limitations of these fairness metrics are and how they can be used in a responsible way and what their role should be in the discourse.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question for Trisha, but of course I missed the first question that you got, so I don't know if this overlaps.
Yeah, go ahead.
But I would just be interested if you've already done some interviews and what your impression is so far, how developers see their own role.
Yeah, I've done a couple, not enough to give you any anything tangible, but one quote has standing out for me, and it's and I'm chewing on it a little bit, but this person said, so I'm asking directly, do you consider yourself a technician? I do the work, I code what I'm asked to code, I do it clean, I document it well, and then I go home. Or do you consider yourself a professional who's aiming for a good? And this person said, I consider myself a professional who's aiming for a good. My boss thinks of me as a technician. And so then we get into these issues of ethical distress and ethical, I'm blanking on the word, but there's this kind of ethical distress that can happen on the part of the developer. And what am I doing? Because I don't actually have the full sense of things. So I think I might find more of that, but we'll see. It seems to be, because it's such a new field altogether, and it's growing so fast. I think I saw something that they're doubling every 2 years, the number of people coming into this. And so you sort of lack an ongoing iterative ethical process within a field that's growing as fast as it is. So we'll see, but I've only done a couple, so.
Thank you, Trisha. Matt has a question.
Yeah, a question for Trisha as well. Thank you for your talk. I wonder, from your background in bioethics, like if you know whether or not the difficulty of becoming a doctor was part of the creating an ethical identity in that profession, and if there's because anybody can kind of become a computer software engineer, like there's no professional vetting or hazing or whatever med school is that component missing from the development of an ethically rounded professional identity?
Yes, it is missing. It is. So I'm trying not to bias myself here, because I think, I'm not sure that, given the 4 criteria I have, that anybody in an AI ethics position qualifies as a professional. They may all be technicians just based on my 4 criteria. And again, I'm very early, so I might change my mind about what these are. But they may actually, in some cases, be even one step further out, and they're employees. So they're only really bound to whatever's in their job description and their company. It is, I think, an issue that I can get on Code Academy or something, run through the whole gamut of their Python classes, learn how to code Python, and provided I can pass Facebook's test, I can now be a developer. And there's a paper, I'm blanking on the guy's name, but he, I'll find it and I'll put it in the notes, but he's basically claiming that ethicists need to learn how to code before that we can have conversations about what ethics is in this space. And I don't think that's right. I think it needs to be the other way around, which is part of why I want to do this research, is that I think that whatever the education you're getting, whatever you're doing to learn how to code, that ethics has to really be, it is up to you in that role to learn how to be ethical doing it. And I think that is kind of what happened in medicine, is that doctors, that they sort of realized that there's some real scoundrels out there who are just taking advantage of people, and that they needed to put some things in place that said only these people can be doctors. And that creates a whole level of elitism too, that has its whole separate set of issues, but I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you, Tricia. And there is a question for Karina on chat. Mustafa asks, how do you see the different perceptions, contextual cultural differences in perception interpretations of fairness in your study?
Oh, that's a really good question. So first of all, fairness is of course super contextual. And so what we do with these group fairness metrics when we make a choice is trying to evaluate the problem domain, the context of the problem, and trying to find the fairness metric that fits that problem. But that's still not an objective thing to figure out. It's still subjective to some extent. And then of course we have to acknowledge that, well, first of all, these group fairness metrics haven't really been related to any philosophical accounts of justice. So we're still working on that. But then, of course, they are very much influenced by Western philosophy. And so any cultural influences are still lacking in that domain. So this is definitely something that's up for future research, but I haven't looked into that yet at all.
Karina, you wanted to add something else?
Very briefly, just another question for Tricia. I was just wondering if you also consider the background of the people you do interviews with to see if they've maybe taken AI ethics classes and if that has any influence on how they see themselves.
Yeah, those questions are definitely in my book of questions, is whether or not they did any ethics training while they were learning to code, and is there, or are they aware of an ethics body at their workplace? Do they ever have conversations about ethics of what they're doing within their team? And would they feel comfortable bringing up an ethics concern about what they were doing at work? So these are all kind of booked into the questions I'm asking, is whether or not they're able to have those discussions, if they have them. And I've talked to somebody who's like, no, I've never even thought of it. It never comes up. So which is telling too, that it's not something that's even on the radar for some people, but for others, they definitely have the conversations. Yeah.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to thank Tricia, Karina, and Sylvie again for their wonderful presentations. And now, before we go to the last round of our roundtable workshop, I would propose to go and have a 5-minute break, and we'll come back at 8 past 8, whatever conversion works in your time zone. Yes, so I'll see you guys in 5 minutes.
Okay, so welcome to the second part of the PhD in AI Ethics Students Roundtable. I will take the lead for this last part of the session to introduce you our last round of speakers. We have Matt Hastings, also Ana Puzio, Leslie Diaz, and also Andreanne will be with us, let's say, remotely via video. Unfortunately, Sheila cannot be with us today, but also if you are interested in her research, I encourage you to contact her via email or LinkedIn, etc. So without further ado, I will give the floor to Matt.
Thank you. I'm coming to you today from Denver, Colorado, and I'm an instructor at Colorado School of Mines teaching tech ethics. Recently finished my PhD, where I studied the digital attention economy, tech ethics, and education policy. I don't have slides. I just have a little talk, little argument. So what are we doing in studying and writing about the ethics of technology? What are we doing here together today? Primarily, I see us responding to a new concentration of economic, political, and cultural power. Digital tools and systems have allowed a few private organizations to amass immense influence over our private and public lives. It seems to me that within the tech ethics community, we are often addressing those with power, providing criticism, advice, policies, frameworks, processes, in order to align these powerful tools with notions of human flourishing and justice against dominant currents of disruption and development that are not always aligned with human goods. This makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of potential for doing good through these strategies. And I think these efforts reflect an emerging recognition that digital companies and systems are becoming, whether they like it or not, private governments that legislate our lives through every line of code they write. A private government has the ability to create and control subjects. Our dependence on companies like Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, and Google, and their ability to influence our beliefs and behaviors creates a governing relationship. They are private governments in that they actively work to prevent public oversight. Their operations are presented as none of our business. We have experienced private governments before. The monarchies of Europe created and controlled subjects while excluding them from participating in defining the terms of their participation. And in response to that, publics emerged. Publics emerged with the advent of new technology, mass printing, and around the resulting circulation of texts. These texts directly address the identity of those in the public, asking and answering the question, who are we? In response to monarchies, publics circulated texts that identified members as individual autonomous sovereigns who, in having a shared fate, had a right to participate in shared governance of their lives. Publics stood apart from formal institutions and systems of government, and through their independence served as a powerful check on unaccountable private power. So what I want to pose to you all today is that the tech ethics community would benefit from engaging in a similar kind of public formation. While it is important to create texts that aim to guide those in power, I think it's at least equally important to create texts that address ourselves, asking and answering, who are we? I think the central challenge of ethics in the digital age is providing a new identity, well suited to live alongside these powerful tools and guide their creation in accordance with this identity. There are good examples of these kinds of texts. Shannon Valor's Technology and the Virtues, Matthew Crawford's The World Outside Your Head, Jeremy Near's You're Not a Gadget, Jenny Odell's How to Do Nothing. One of the themes across these texts is a shift away from describing ourselves as autonomous and emphasizing our heteronomy. So over the past several years, I've really enjoyed joining the tech ethics community, meeting people with shared concerns, learning about research projects, reading provocative and helpful writing. There are so many of these organizations popping up at universities, in tech companies, and public institutions, as nonprofits, and through social media platforms. I see the emergence of these organizations as parallel to the reading publics that emerged in response to monarchies. People addressing each other, calling others into a shared audience around shared concerns. Organizations like PhD students in AI ethics are creating a space for this work to circulate and for people like myself to forge a professional identity. But I'm still wondering whether we are addressing ourselves in terms of a broader sense of our identities living within digital systems. Are our texts engaging in world making? Are we sufficiently utopian? Are they creating a context in which new ways of living and associating can emerge? Are we addressing a sufficiently wide audience? In addition to the policy documents and sociological analysis we're writing, Should we be creating art, memes, manifestos, chapters, practices, dress, habits, norms, or even a declaration of dependence? In closing, I don't want to be a consumer or a user or a creator. I don't want to be data. I don't want to be the product. I don't think digital citizenship lands right either. So I'm still searching for an identity amidst all this change. And I'm wondering if you are too. How does coming together with you all, with our shared concerns about how digital tech can be used to help us live well, create a context for engaging in new ways of living? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matt. And now let's continue with our next speaker. Anna, are you there? You are muted.
Hello. I hope you can see the presentation. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. My name is Anna Puzio. I'm a theologian and philosopher. I'm a PhD student late stage in philosophy in Munich with the scholarship from the Untitled Foundation. And my research area is the anthropology and ethics of AI. And my PhD thesis is on the anthropology of transhumanism. I'm delighted to be here today to briefly introduce you to my PhD topic. Let me start with a brief, short description of transhumanism. Transhumanism is a philosophical technological movement of the 20th and 21st century which advocates intervention in the human organism through advanced technologies. What are the issues and visions of transhumanism? Transhumanism strives for radical life extension and infinite lifespans. Second, it promotes cryonics. It promotes human enhancement. Transhumanists want to technologically optimize healthy human beings. Moreover, transhumanism seeks the elimination of suffering and new sensory perceptions. Mind uploading, the upload of mind, is the hypothetical futuristic process of scanning a physical structure of the brain and copying it into an external device like a computer. So transhumanists suggest that the whole human being can easily be uploaded onto a hard drive. Transhumanism claims to be a philosophical movement as well, which is why I examine the philosophical assumptions of transhumanism, focusing on ethics and especially anthropology. Since transhumanism is concerned with the improvement of human beings, the question of how humans are understood in this specific context is crucial. Various anthropological assumptions can be identified in transhumanism. For example, transhumanism assumes a human nature, and this human nature is deficient and must be improved by technologies. Transhumanism compares humans and machines. Humans are seen as machines, and machines are supposed to replace humans. It refers to genetics or neuroscience. For transhumanism, the human being is essentially determined by genes or by the neuronal, and the brain plays a central role. Transhumanism also places a high value in information. Humanity is thought of as an algorithm, especially in the vision of mind uploading. There are also many ethical questions related to the anthropology. Is transhumanism's understanding of humanity ethical, defensible? And why is the understanding of human beings highly relevant, for example, for AI ethics? The visions of transhumanism are speculative, but they're envisioned in the present and shape how we already understand humanity today. What makes our conception of humans so important? According to Karl Jaspers, our conception of human influences our actions, our relationships, and how we shape society. Beyond transhumanism, the anthropology of technology is also very significant. Technology is very present in our everyday lives. The use of technology alters how we understand being human. For example, medical visualization technologies affect how we see human beings and bodies, what images we have of the body. Or smart watches alter how we perceive our body, which body data we focus on. The ideas of transhumanism, which fundamentally question the human being, make it possible to question traditional anthropological concepts and to renegotiate the understanding of the human being. For example, where's the boundary between the body and technology? Can technology also be understood as part of the body? And what still distinguishes humans from machines or animals? Alternatively, what should distinguish humans from machines? Thus, this dissertation investigates how technological change affects understandings of human beings and their bodies, thereby requiring new approaches to anthropology. I'm happy to receive your feedback now. On a side note, I'm also looking for a job and I'm happy to receive any hints. If you have any further questions, don't hesitate to contact me. You can see my website, email address, and social media accounts in the presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Anna. Very thoughtful. I'm sure that there will be things to comment on the Q&A round. And now I would like to give the floor to today's moderator and also my colleague, Leslie Diaz.
Thank you, Natalia, and thank you everyone for being here. So my name, as you know, is Leslie Diaz. I am conducting a PhD at the Ruhr-Universität Bochum in Germany, and I am on the early stages of my PhD. So I would just like to tell you a little bit about my PhD project and get your feedback, comments, and your questions. In general, I hold that there seems to be a disconnection between the hype of what the newest technological developments on AI can achieve in healthcare, more specifically in the area of diagnosis, and the fear of what consequences might result from their implementation. So for me, it's of utmost relevance to clarify what actually are the potential benefits and the risks of the application of machine learning and deep learning models, to weigh them up and to morally evaluate them, because only then the pathways can be developed to augment the benefits and to try to avert or minimize the risks. So the main research questions of my project are: what are the existing and realistic potential applications of machine learning in medical diagnosis? What benefits derive from those possibilities? And how can they enhance the rights of the right bearers? In turn, what could be the risks and how they threaten those rights? And for this, I would like to apply a rights-based and normative approach to kind of create a framework that can help to minimize said risks and strengthen those benefits. So the development of my project is intended to reflect my objective to, so my idea that interdisciplinary work between disciplines is super important, and to converge the theoretical understanding of the technical possibilities of machine learning applied to medical diagnosis and the practical aim of normative ethics grounded on a rights-based approach. So in a way, I see the area of normative applied ethics as a bridge builder between fields which are far from each other, like computer science and healthcare. And that these fields had, in the attempt to make fast progress, had forgotten that there is a fundamental need to find epistemological and ethical ground in order to actually advance sustainably. So one of the topics that I would be focusing on is the problem of allocation of responsibility. So there are different considerations here. For example, in the scenario where a system is used to aid a physician to diagnose patients, there are likely outcomes, for example, that the system's advice, it's right or it's wrong. And for example, in the first case, if the physician does not hit the diagnosis made by the AI system at the expense of the patient's health or even their life, does one have to ask a question, does this increase the liability of the physician? And conversely, if the system's results are wrong and the physician made the decision based on this advice, who is to be responsible? The physician or the system? Can be the responsibility be distributed? For example, are the developers in charge of the design of the algorithms liable, even though they did not make the final decision? These are some of the questions that I'm likely trying to find out a question for. And I believe that it is urgent to reflect on the specific benefits and risks from this, as I said, risk ethics approach. A basic assumption of this approach is that every person possesses equal rights, and these rights are equal in the sense that they talk to the necessary conditions for being able to lead their own life. So these conditions, these rights, are not on the same level, and they form a hierarchy due to the situational differences and how these conditions become indispensable. And a second assumption is that there are positive rights as well as negative rights. So it's important to focus on not only not harming people, but also helping people. And these rights are also from the people who can be like affected, but also from the people who might be imposing those risks. And so how does this look like for AI ethics? So, well, I take that the concerns that there are seem to be in that the field have are concerns about the risks of AI. However, evaluating risks in general, it's very complicated. And it's like the normative already existing framework are not very good at them. So I'm planning to draw from this risk perspective to present as an assessment of who are the rights holders present in the equation, and how can we create a hierarchy of rights that can be established in order to protect those rights. For example, minorities, for example, patients, and I would also like to address the rights of physicians. And in this topic, I would like to address the topics of burnout, deontology, and professional de-skilling. So all in all, I aim to bring an approach that can help bridge this gap between computer science, healthcare, and ethics from a normative risk approach. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Leslie. And last but not least, our last presenter is Andreanne. Unfortunately, she will not be here because she's teaching at the present moment, but she recorded her presentation. So now we are going to play the video she recorded for us.
Okay. I will be in charge of doing this. So can you see my screen?
Yes.
Hi, everyone.
Can you also hear this, like here? Okay, perfect.
First, I'd like to thank the organizers of this event, especially for allowing me to participate through this video, given the schedule conflict that prevents me from being here with you live today. Perhaps a few words about me before I begin. My name is Andréanne Sabourin-Laflamme. I live in Canada in the province of Quebec, in the city of Montreal. I've been teaching philosophy in college for 10 years now, and last year I've undertaken a doctoral research project in law at the University of Quebec in Montreal. The research project is funded by the Canada Graduate Scholarships. I'm also the co-founder of a research lab, LINEA, the Digital and AI Ethics Lab, where we're conducting various research projects. So as you know, the increasing presence of AI systems in our various sectors of activity is causing a profound transformation that raises ethical, social, and normative issues that we only have begun to analyze. And the incredible progress that has been made possible with this technology certainly allows us to hope that it can contribute substantially to facing the most important challenges that humanity will encounter in the 21st century. We think of climate change, chronic diseases, poverty, or epidemics. But this should not hide the fact that there are numerous risks that are related with the growing delegation of human decision-making processes to AI systems. We all know that algorithms now are not neutral. Studies have shown that they convey values and that they're powerful vectors of social mediation. They can also transform our conception of the world and can even modify its socio-political organization. AI system can reproduce the biases that they are embedded, they are embedded in the data that they are fed with. They have been proven to be sources of injustices and discrimination. And research has also uncovered the fact that the modus operandi of several dominant actors in the digital economy consists of usurping users' personal data with the aim of predicting and influencing their behavior, and this for mercantile, political, and ideological purposes. And this business model threatens our right to privacy and also our autonomy. Given these numerous risks, and to make sure that this powerful technology is used in a way that is beneficial for individual and communities, the implementation of appropriate AI governance mechanism is urgent. And over the past decades, as you all know, publications in AI ethics, this new field that has recently emerged as a new branch of applied ethics, have multiplied. And also, important legislative reforms have been initiated around the world, primarily with respect to personal data, biometrics, and facial recognition technologies. And while ethics and regulation are unquestionably two distinct normative domains, the premise of my research project is that they are two essential components of an appropriate and effective AI governance model. While a better legislative framework for technology related to AI is necessary, undoubtedly, AI governance cannot do without a philosophical reflection on the values and ethical principles that should frame the development and implementation of this technology in our information societies. I propose in my thesis a reflection that would be deployed in three axes. The first axis will aim to identify the essential contribution, but also the limits of ethics in governance. Starting from a literature review, I intend to map the different theoretical approaches that are emerging within this field in order to identify the most promising avenues and at different level of the ethical reflection, whether at the level of normative ethics, applied ethics, public ethics, and professional ethics. The second axis will be devoted to a reflection on the normative framework that can be provided by state, regional, and international law with respect to AI. I'll look at the most promising legislative advances in the world, and I'll seek to identify the most relevant approach, whether sectoral or general. I'll look in particular at the human rights framework and try to find out how it can help to avoid the adverse effect of AI on individuals and communities. And finally, in the third axis, I'll try to identify a theoretical framework that allows us to think the normative function of ethics and law in governance. And my hypothesis is that normative pluralism offers us the tools that are needed to situate ethics and law in relation to each other. And I'll try to show that we have to think about the relationship in a complementary way. We must therefore depart from positivist conception of law. Thank you.
Well, I also encourage you all, if you have any further questions or comments regarding Antoine's presentation, to send her an email or to contact her. And now let's do the final round of Q&A regarding our three last speakers, Matt, Leslie, and Anna. I saw that, Mustafa, you put a question to Anna on the Q&A section, but for some reason, now I cannot see. Can you see it, Leslie?
Yes. So I think Anna, it's answering, I think, but he asked. I can imagine both subjective as well as objective perspective of human beings in transhumanism. Am I right? I don't know if maybe Anna wants to answer this live, or I think yes. I think.
Sorry, I did have a problem with the question because I couldn't understand it right with subjective and objective, and I answered him to discuss it maybe per email probably, if it's okay. Or maybe he can explain his question more, I don't know.
Oh, it's no problem. Like I think one of the the thing we encourage is that we network with each other and that we discuss our research at large through email or other ways.
Okay.
So yes, and so okay, so as
Yes. Go back. Also feel free to post any other questions via chat on the Q&A and also between the panelists. In the meantime, if there are no questions, I would like to ask Matt, because I found your presentation very interesting. And I was wondering, at the same time you were speaking, how to operationalize this proposal that you made us, or during your speech. And I don't know if you are aware of this literature regarding, also because of your American background, regarding using the model of the FDA. So there are some papers about an FDA for algorithms and also an FDA to regulate facial recognition. So I was wondering if you think that would be a possible, let's say, body or operationalization of your model, and also who do you think should be involved in this, let's say, hypothetical FDA, whether they would be people from AI ethics only, but also supported by lawyers, by engineers, by computer scientists?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think bodies like the FDA are doing good work, but I think they tend to be also on the speaking to people with power side. You know, they're trying to create documents of guidance for people running AI within powerful companies or the government. And what I'm hoping for or wanting to see is people in the tech ethics community addressing ourselves more directly. Who do we want to be living with these tools? What do we want our lives to look like? You know, in a way that people 400 or 500 years ago in Europe were not even that long, but we're writing about who are we? You know, what does it mean to be a citizen? What is it? You know, these were new ideas and new identities that emerged from these textual communities, and they made a lot of mistakes, right? Like early publics were focused on the identity of white, wealthy merchant men, and they had these ideas of rational autonomy, and so they missed a lot of human nature or human experience in these descriptions, but they still really set out to describe who they were, what is their identity, and then systems of governance emerged in response. Okay, if we're like this, then we need a world that looks like this. So similarly, I'm hoping we can begin to write towards each other more directly and say, okay, like, who are we? What does it mean to be a person right now? And then based on that, how do we develop these AI systems to help us flourish together based on these conceptions? So yeah, I'm hoping to see more writing like that is basically what I'm asking for.
Okay, and I'm thinking now that this group, as you mentioned, could be also a possible hub for this discussion. So maybe we should talk in the future about how to make this group play a role in this super interesting debate. Yeah, Leslie, you have your hand up.
Yes, I just had a quick small question for Anna. So you are talking about transhumanism, and you also mentioned you're a theologian. So I know for a fact that so there's like conflicting approaches to transhumanism from different sides of the spectrum. So I was curious about what is your opinion on transhumanism?
My opinion is that theology should discuss transhumanism more, because it's very important, because transhumanism uses a lot of religious motives, such like paradise or eternal life or elimination of suffering. So there are so many interfaces, and it's really important. But from a philosophical perspective too, I'm also critical and really skeptic about transhumanism, because it has because its understanding of human beings neglects certain aspects of human life, and it's really focusing on perfection, and it's neglecting, for example, plurality of human beings, and so it's also discriminating. So I'm also critical. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Leslie, there's a question to you from Trisha, sorry. She says, well, if you want to pose it yourself, but she says, I am curious about what you said regarding the skilling of medical professionals. Do you foresee medical school training shifting from absorbing as much knowledge about human anatomy as possible to one where they are trained to better explain what an AI is doing?
Thank you for the question, Tricia. This is actually one of my favorite parts of my project, the skilling part. So I am convinced, or as far as I've been researching, that there is a big aspect of what the consequences of AI might be for example, labor displacement. And under labor displacement, we have the impact on professional skills. However, the concept of the skilling, it's, in my opinion, a bit like it lacks purpose, because it now assumes that AI is going to radically push the skills of the physicians, for example, to a point in which they're not necessary anymore. And this reminds me, maybe you heard it a few years ago, that some people were saying that in a few years, radiologists were going to be outdated, and there was not going to be any reason for training this kind of clinicians. So I don't think that medical school training is going to shift from this. I think, as we have seen, the process of medical education is going to transition from being like encyclopedic. It's been like transitionally like not being this way anymore, and it's going to become more focused on what it's needed for XY type of physician. And I think there's going to include definitely how to explain AI results if we get to the point in which we actually implement AI in healthcare, which is not yet a realistic thing happening right now.
Right. The reason this came up for me is a friend got recently diagnosed with a heart murmur, and her doctor told her that physicians have over the years lost the ability to hear a heart murmur with their ears, because the EKG has basically taken that skill now sits with the EKG. So this was sort of, it's been in my head since this doctor said, you know, we can't do it, and we can't hear murmurs with our ears, heart murmurs with our ears anymore. So just how technology starts to kind of pull some of the expertise, because it does a better job, frankly. The EKG does a better job than the human ear. So yeah,
that's true. And what I call it, instead of the skilling, is the shift of skills. And in my opinion, this is from a perspective, a natural process of some technologies coming into certain fields and doing a better job at some of the things they do, and then some skills disappear. So that's one of them. I hear, for example, the use of a stethoscope eliminated the need for physicians to be trained with their ears to diagnose certain type of diseases. So, and nobody's going to say that a stethoscope is a bad thing, right? So I think that first we need to clarify what is actually happening to the skills of physicians, and to bring ethics to the question, so we don't start using or relying on AI or whatever other technology comes excessively. So the effect happens to be negative. So I think again, like my general proposal on my idea on my PhD is like, stay away from the hype and stay away from the excessive fear, and try to find with ethics a path to clarify all this and find a way to progress sustainably.
Perfect. Jesus has his hand up.
Yeah, I would like to ask actually the three of you, no, because I think one of the issues that it was mentioned yesterday, but not so much today, is autonomy. Autonomy and how algorithms in general are occupying more and more spaces of decision making, no? And that is something that is visible in the diagnostic because I mean, decisions are taken by algorithms, or classification is taken, or diagnosis is taken by algorithms. So that type of decision is taken away from the physicist and maybe also the patient. But that may also happen with transhumanism, and that also relates to Matt. What is the vision of a digital future that we should aspire to when more and more decisions are not taken by us? That's my question. Sorry.
So
Who would like to
whoever
start?
wants to jump in, yeah.
Okay, so I can start. This is actually probably one of the cornerstones of my project, because it is a very complicated question. And I think it relates, I mean, I was thinking about Matt's presentation, and how one of the big questions is the way AI is changing how we see ourselves and how we relate to the other. So in this case, it's the machine or the system, or in the future to AGI. So, and in this like play of how we see we see us in other people, then the question for autonomy, it starts to change. And okay, so I'm going to just place it in the healthcare environment. So let's say 45, 50 years ago, I remember that I would read about how the doctor had the last word on a treatment. So he was the one deciding which was the best way to do something. And I mean, it was the era of so-called paternalism. And now we have shifted towards a era of patients being able to be more autonomous on their decisions when there's something related to their health, right? So, and I think with the introduction of AI, the question is how how we see ourselves, and how important it's for put a limit to what AI can do and what we let it do. So I cannot give you like a conclusive answer, honestly, but I think, in my opinion, that autonomy as a biomedical principle, it's very important. I think that AI can give patients and doctors the tools to enhance that autonomy, but we need to be very careful when using it and how to use it.
I'm also happy to hop in. I would just argue that, well, two things. One, I think we should get ahead of the narrative. Not let AI or digital systems begin changing our conceptions of who we are. I mean, they are, right? But if we can develop a more robust narrative about who we are, or who we are moving forward, and try to get ahead of the technology and the technological change, I think that's one interesting proposition. So I think here of like utopian literature or science fiction, solar punk, like Afrofuturism, like people who are trying to articulate new visions of what it means to be a person, and then try to let those be compelling enough that the technology tries to catch up. Because I am worried about powerful companies using AI to create a narrow and very concrete definition of who we are based on what they want us to be. But I think part of that is abandoning the notion of autonomy. I don't think it's ever been accurate in the first place. And I think one way to get ahead of it is to not pretend we're autonomous, because then our interactions with these tools appear to be a choice, right? Like I'm choosing to go on Facebook, I'm choosing to look at ads, I'm choosing to click something. And so like, it makes me look responsible for the manipulation that's occurring. Rather, let's just admit, like, we're heteronymous, and we're always designing environments in which we're making choices. So let's participate in that design as some way to create a new identity.
Okay, Anna, do you want to add something? You're muted.
I agree what Leslie said, that I see in their investigation on transhumanism that ethical principles like autonomy, they are changing. And concerning transhumanism, I have to say that in the context of machines, we don't forget that we have autonomy. So transhumanism try to raise fear and say that that machines have the control, but I plea neither for technophobia nor techno-euphoria. So we have the control, and yeah, let's do ethics. And I find it very interesting that these ethical concepts and ethical principles like autonomy are changing due to technology. That's very important.
Thank you, Tricia. I see that your hand's up.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of add to this discussion about, and it reminded me of something one of our colleagues said yesterday. And I think she's doing a lot of her work on human dignity with respect to AI, and something, and I'm blanking on her name, I'm sorry, but that autonomy, because a lot of these concepts come up through medical ethics, that dignity often gets kind of used as a synonym with autonomy. And I think it's important, in especially what Matt is saying about us having kind of this socio-technological imagination of imagining a world worth living in, where human beings are flourishing, that we do start to separate this notion of dignity from this notion of autonomy, where, you know, what does it actually mean for us to be flourishing in a society where technology is kind of very much a part of how we interact with each other and how we interact with the world. So.
Thank you. Are there any other questions, comments? Okay, if not, I would like to thank the panelists and also the spectators, and especially Leslie for moderating, and also Beck for organizing. And I would like to give the last word to Leslie as moderator of the sessions, but thank you everybody very much.
Thank you, Natalia. I want to echo you and thank all the panelists for the presentations, for the input. It was amazing to listen to you today. I think that this group has achieved a wonderful thing of putting us in the same place to discuss, and I foresee that we will have the chance of doing something maybe bigger, maybe longer in upcoming months, years. Hopefully maybe someday presential. That will be interesting to get to know each other face to face. So I want to express my appreciation for your time, for your preparation, for committing to this group. And I know Natalia and I speak in behalf of Beck. She's very excited to have this finally come to fruition. So yes, so thank you for to the attendees for also the participation, and for all the people who would be watching this recording in the future. Please remember to check out our website for the panelists' contact information if someone wants to reach out and maybe discuss projects, discuss collaborations. And aside from that, I thank you for, again, your time, and I bid you all good night.